In the world's poorest country, the average person lives on less than $1 a day, making just $300 a year. Most people live either a nomadic or subsistence lifestyle, living off the food that they can make with their own hands. And just 11% of people have access to electricity. There are lots of countries that you might expect to be the poorest, countries like Syria or Sierra Leone. But the world's poorest country is Burundi, with a GDP per capita of just $259. But why is Burundi so poor? Does it lack natural resources? Does it have a horribly incompetent government printing money to fund reckless spending? The real underlying reasons are not what you might expect. We're going to take a look at the 10 poorest countries in the world to get a sense of what they have in common and bust some myths about what it is that makes countries poor. And I want to start by focusing on some of the assumptions that you might have about why certain countries are poor. The first is really about the availability of natural resources. Most of the countries that are in the top 10 poorest countries in the world are quite rich in natural resources. Burundi, for example, has vast reserves of copper, cobalt, nickel, and gold. Cobalt is one of the most valuable substances in the world. It's used to make phones. Countries like Afghanistan have $1 trillion in proven untapped mineral deposits. The Central African Republic is rich in diamonds, gold, uranium, and other minerals, and diamonds account to 20 to 30% of the Central African Republic's export revenues. Sierra Leone is similarly rich in diamonds and gold. Mozambique has titanium reserves. Eritrea has a bunch of natural resources like copper, gold, granite, marble, and potash. So none of these countries really are suffering from lacking for resources that would be very valuable and very expensive were they sold internationally. What a lot of the countries do have in common is that they lack the technology or the infrastructure to extract those resources. So you could take a country like Somalia, for example, which has some of the largest untapped reserves of natural resources in the world, including uranium, iron ore, tin, gypsum, copper, salt, natural gas, but it lacks the infrastructure to actually extract those resources. But the other thing is, a lot of these countries do have the infrastructure to extract their resources, they just are poor despite the availability of them. So it doesn't look like your natural environment or the resources that are available to you make a massive difference in terms of securing you a certain amount of wealth as a country. Another thing that may be a little bit surprising is that the countries that are in the top 10 poorest in the world don't collectively have a ton of debt. So countries like Somalia, Syria, and Afghanistan, possibly for obvious reasons, don't have very good data. But if we look at countries like say Burundi or Niger or Madagascar, Burundi has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 68.3%. This puts it kind of slap bang in the middle of all the countries in the world. It's the 65th highest debt-to-GDP ratio, and Niger and Madagascar are kind of in the same category. So Niger has a 51% debt-to-GDP ratio. That means there's 108 countries with a more serious debt problem than Niger. Madagascar similarly has a 56.9% debt-to-GDP ratio. These three countries really are not doing too badly when it comes to debt. Eritrea has a much more significant debt-to-GDP ratio. It's actually the third most indebted country in the world with 163%, so it's an exception on this list. Mozambique has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 104.5%. That makes them the 23rd worst in the world, which might sound really bad until you realize that the UK is 24th. So debt isn't really a commonality here. And the most indebted countries in the world aren't necessarily the poorest. So government debt isn't really a very good predictor of how poor countries are. And the other myth that I'd like to dispel, or at least common explanation that maybe isn't sufficient to explain why these countries specifically are so poor, is a legacy of colonialism. Yes, all of these countries were colonized and have a history of colonization. However, that is going to be true for a very significant portion of the countries in the world. It's not really a good explanation for why specifically these 10 countries are so poor. right? There are many countries that are colonized that are outperforming them. These countries are colonized by different states. So it's not necessarily sufficient as an explanation. Obviously, having a history of colonialism is a good predictor of how impoverished a country is now, but it doesn't explain why these countries specifically are the very poorest. But there are certain characteristics that all of these countries share, or at least the vast majority of these countries share, that I think gives a pretty good indication of why they're so impoverished. The first is that all of these countries are primarily agriculturally focused. They're not particularly industrialized. For example, in Burundi, 32.9% of the gross domestic product is in agriculture, and over 70% of the labor force is working directly in agriculture, the majority of that being in subsistence farming, so not industrialized agriculture. This is people working small plots of land to support themselves and their families. Sierra Leone is another good example of this. 2/3 of the population in Sierra Leone works in agriculture. That's 58% of the national GDP. And if you go down the list, Mozambique, Niger, Eritrea, all of these economies are heavily dominated by agriculture that is for the most part not very industrialized. The reason this matters so much to poverty levels is, on the first level, it's not a very productive use of labor, especially subsistence agriculture. If you've got a population, like the lowest output thing you can do as an individual is till a small plot of land using minimal tools. You're basically working extremely long hours, extremely hard to provide only enough food to support yourself, maybe a little bit to sell at market and to support your family. But you're only producing basically to meet your very basest needs, which means you're not very economically productive. Generally, this indicates poor use of technology, poor use of economies of scale in agriculture. It indicates that you have probably quite a low level of education. Your GDP can't be that high if a significant portion of your population is dedicated towards agriculture. But the other big problem here is if it's not particularly industrialized agriculture, it makes you super vulnerable to droughts or rainfall. Like if you're not using irrigation infrastructure and you rely on the rain to provide water to your crops, a bad year can completely destroy your harvest. That can force you to borrow lots of money. It forces the government to borrow money to provide food. And it means that even though these 10 countries are really dominated by agriculture, a lot of them are still net food importers or are still dependent on foreign aid and humanitarian assistance to meet their basic food needs. So even though if your population is working 70% in the agricultural sector, you're still not making enough food to support that population. The second commonality that's true in almost every case is a history of recent conflict, specifically in the last 25 years or so. And in a lot of cases, these wars are ongoing, or there's a sort of low-grade level of conflict that continues to happen within a country. And the really obvious examples in this list are Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. But there's also a lot of these countries that maybe you wouldn't think are having a civil war, but in fact have had recent conflict and violence. So in Burundi, for example, there was a civil war that lasted from 1993 to 2005 as a result of ethnic tensions between Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups. And a lot of this war uses child soldiers. There's an estimated death total of around 300,000 people. And critically, 8 million people are currently internally displaced within Burundi. So even though the war ends in 2005, a massive portion of the population are effectively domestic refugees within Burundi. Other countries too, like the Central African Republic, experienced the Central African Republic Civil War, which continues to go on to this day. Sierra Leone has a civil war from 1991 to 2002, during which an estimated 2.5 million people were displaced. And it's not particularly interesting argument, but obviously war and conflict is going to destroy a lot of a country's physical infrastructure. You have long-standing problems even decades after a civil war concludes, like landmines being left around, which can make it very difficult to industrialize things like agriculture. It can cause a lot of health problems. It means a lot of your population, if they step on a landmine and become permanently disabled, they're not that economically productive. But also, the large displacement of your population is really critical because it means people are taken away from land that they could work to provide for themselves and instead are reliant on state support, or they are, again, sort of susceptible to criminal organizations or to joining militia groups because they're in such a dire economic position. Having lots of domestic displacement means that a lot of your population are not in a position to be very economically useful, and the destabilization that comes from a civil war can continue to last for decades after that civil war ends. And Burundi is a good example of this because there's still 8 million people displaced today, even though the civil war ended in 2005. And so there's still sort of low-grade conflict that continues because structurally those problems have never been resolved. And the final thing that's true in almost all of these cases, although there are a couple of exceptions, is that there's limited domestic energy resources. So a country like Burundi, for example, has no coal or oil resources. It has to import 31% of the energy it consumes. A lot of the rest of the energy comes from things like hydroelectric dams. Eritrea also has no domestic sources of oil, coal, natural gas, or hydropower. A country like Somalia does have oil reserves, but isn't producing any oil because it doesn't have the technology to access it. Sierra Leone is a net energy importer. The Central African Republic relies almost exclusively on wood and charcoal to provide its energy needs, which is not very efficient. And then you do have countries that have some petroleum reserves, for example, Syria and Niger. But these still are not, you wouldn't call them petrostates, right? So Niger produces a lot of petroleum products, but it's still a net importer of electricity from neighboring African countries. So despite having petroleum reserves, it's not able to produce energy effectively from those oil reserves to provide support to their own population. And Syria similarly isn't producing a ton from its oil reserves because of the civil war, and also doesn't have massive oil reserves by a regional standard. So it's not like Iran or Saudi Arabia, which have really significant oil reserves. The reason why this is a problem, like not having access to energy resources, is it becomes very difficult to industrialize if you don't have access to consistent and cheap electricity. I mean, electricity is going to power all kinds of machinery. It's going to provide a source of revenue to the government. So countries that have really significant oil reserves, even if it can sometimes throw off economic development, because famously of the resource curse, which we'll cover in depth in other videos, even if it provides that kind of negative effect, you're still getting a source of government revenue that can be invested elsewhere, and you are still getting cheap domestic energy that can facilitate industrialization and makes it easier for countries to subsist. And the key takeaway, I think, would be this: if a country is able to effectively supply its own food through agricultural industrialization and supply itself with a cheap amount of domestic energy, it's going to really struggle to be on this list of the 10 poorest countries in the world. Because those, even if you're still a relatively impoverished country, you're going to be able to facilitate some kind of industrialization, some kind of economic development if you can meet those criteria of not having a civil war, of having access to decent, affordable sources of energy, and if you can produce agriculture in an efficient way that actually supports your domestic population.